Hello, fellow crime followers, and welcome back to the Criminal Conundrums, the series in which we dive into cases that put innocent people in jail because of biased evidence and ethics gone wrong. Today we dive into the case of Stephen Mark Chaney, a man accused of murder and sentenced to a lifetime in jail. On June 20th, 1987, Rhea Jack Rasnick and his girlfriend Nicole went to John and Sally Sweek's apartment after failing to reach them both by telephone and finding them absent from planned gatherings. They knocked on their door around 6 p.m., and with no answer they left, then returning between 9 and 9:30 p.m. That is when they looked through the window by their front door. When they looked inside, they could see two bodies lying on the floor of the couple's kitchen. In a panic, both Jack and his girlfriend went home, unsure of what to do. Later that night, they called Sweek's other family members. Soon, Rick Sweek and Henry Sweek arrived with the police officer John Robert Hilton among the crew. When they entered the apartment, they discovered John and Sally in the kitchen. Both had been stabbed and their throats slit. The scene was highly bloody, with bloody prints around the apartment leading to the front door. Stephen Mark Chaney was connected to the couple because he often bought cocaine from them. The deals took place in their apartment. Chaney knew them as friends through their deals. Many had thought Chaney murdered the couple because he owed John money for the cocaine, and his debt gave him a reason to kill. Curtis Hilton, a co-worker of Chaney's, testified to this and said that he and Chaney regularly bought cocaine as often as 3 to 4 times a week in the month prior to the murders. Hilton had also testified that Sweek had told him that Chaney's debt was the largest of any customer and that Sweek had desperately needed the debt to be paid. This evidence tied Chaney to the case, and he was taken as a suspect. In court, Chaney was tried in 1989, 2 years after the murder. He was convicted of a double murder based largely on mishandled or misinterpreted forensic evidence. The key evidence included a bite mark on John Sweek's left arm. The bite mark testimony was the centerpiece of the case. Doctors Jim Hales and Homer Campbell testified that Chaney's teeth matched the bite marks on the victim's arms. Dr. Hayes claimed there was only a 1 out of 1 million people who could have made the bite mark. Dr. Campbell testified that to a reasonable degree of dental certainty that the mark matched Chaney's dentation. Shoe prints or shoe patterns in the crime scene seemingly also matched Chaney's tennis shoes. A test was done on Chaney's tennis shoes for blood. The patterns in the bloody shoe prints found in the apartment matched with Chaney's shoes. There was also a partial fingerprint that belonged to Chaney on the lower kitchen wall. The fingerprint evidence also indicated that the partial thumbprint was seen to match as Chaney's. Both the alleged presence of blood on the shoes and the shoe patterns were used to bolster the bite mark statement claim. Although the defense had an alibi witness asserting Chaney's whereabouts before and during the crime, and 9 other alibi witnesses testifying the times around that, the jury evidently found the forensic testimony, especially the bite mark, more persuasive. Over the years, his legal team, including the Innocence Project and the Dallas District Attorney's Conviction Integrity Unit, worked to re-examine the case, particularly the bite mark evidence in which had become discredited in forensic science. On October 12, 2015, a Texas District Court judge overturned Chaney's conviction and a relief was granted, effectively freeing him after more than 25 years in prison. Then, on December 19, 2018, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals officially set aside his conviction, declaring him actually innocent. For decades, Chaney claimed he was innocent in the Dallas murders. He was granted relief by the court, based in part on questions raised by the testimony of the 2 odontologists, who said the bite marks found on John's left arm matched Chaney's teeth and therefore implicated him in the murder. The state's highest criminal court found that Chaney's conviction largely stemmed from that testimony, and that bite mark science had changed considerably by the time of the trial. Once new scientific understanding and further investigation took place, several of the forensics claims used in the trial were shown to be unreliable or false. The bite mark evidence was discredited and had been widely questioned. In this case, Dr. Hales had made the statistical claim that only 1 in a million people could have made the bite mark. But later, he agreed that such certainty exceeded what the science could support. There was also an issue with the shoe print evidence. That was, the pattern of the shoes was a common one rather than an individual one. and the print was used by many athletic shoes at the time, approximately up to 80% of them, so their evidence was not as strong as their testimonies also implied. There was also conflicting reports about whether there was blood on Cheney's shoes. One of the experts initially said yes, but the other said no. There was little to no way to fully determine whether it was human blood or even blood at all. It is not definitively proven that the stain on Cheney's shoe was blood, rather the evidence in the case shows it was alleged to be, with significant uncertainty in dispute though. Also, some of the reports in the prosecution did not disclose the negative test results to the defense, which also swayed the court's decision. Later, post-conviction, DNA testing of all the available crime scene evidence excluded Cheney. From items that were retested, such as the hair found under Sally Sweek's nails and that was elsewhere in the house, they did not match Cheney's. Evidence was found that some statements or expert opinions were not disclosed or were mischaracterized. For example, there were notes from another analyst who observed the spots on Cheney's shoes and believed they were not blood, which were not disclosed in any way to the court or to the defense, and opinions on the bite mark changed over time, including the timing of when the bite mark was inflicted. Some scientists later believed that they might have been 2 or 3 days earlier than the murders, which undermines its probable value. In summary of the evidence, the forensic evidence that was presented turned out not to be accurate enough to support the conviction under modern standards. The conviction was ultimately overturned because of those forensics claims that couldn't be supported upon re-examination, and the forensic evidence, especially the bite markings, had been judged unreliable in many cases. After serving his 28 years in prison, he lost a lot of time and practically all of a normal life. He lost nearly 3 decades in life, career progress, relationships, family, and important moments. He missed witnessing his children and grandchildren grow up. He had been quoted reflecting on what he had lost, saying he missed the death of his oldest stepson and his oldest grandchild. He also suffered a mental and emotional toll, long-term incarceration on a wrongful conviction with feelings of being stuck, anxiety, and stress over waiting for justice. His case impacted many cases to follow, because his case became a high-profile example of wrongful conviction due to junk sciences. Like bite mark evidence, it contributed to a policy change in Texas that has reconsidered the admissibility of bite mark analysis and certain blood-related techniques. After his official exoneration, he was eligible for financial compensation in Texas. The exonerated are usually paid a sum per year of their wrongful incarceration, but the decades of loss and experiences cannot be covered by money, and the emotional damages and challenges of rebuilding a life. In legal court proceedings, bias can play a huge role, not only in how evidence is presented, but also how evidence is taken in by people like the jury and the judge. Certain biases can cause investigators to ignore evidence or interpret it in a way that sways the jury toward their side. In the case of Stephen Mark Cheney, there were many different cases of bias. To start with, the scientific junk science bias, which is more of a problem in the case of the bite mark evidence, being treated as definitive instead of how it actually was, with the field being rendered unreliable, determined by bite mark comparison and its lack of foundational validity. Getting into the actual bias, we can see confirmation bias or tunnel vision in the case when the investigators focused heavily on the bite mark evidence. Despite strong alibi testimonies, they seem to allow the matching bite mark evidence to overshadow other evidence like the alibis. This suggests bias that confirms their existing suspicion and works in their favor. There was overconfidence and misleading statistical claims with the bite mark evidence as well, in which the prosecutors overstated the bite mark evidence on how close it was to Cheney's when there was in fact a very high chance it was anyone else, as well as there being a chance that it had happened days before the murder. The statement was still given, implying their utmost certainty. Diving into the principles that were violated in the Cheney case was an interesting thing to look at, because almost all 4 principles had been violated. Starting with honesty and truthfulness, in the Mark Cheney case, the 1 in 1 million statistical claim made about the bite mark match was false and misleading, given the scientific state of the knowledge. The expert later countered the level of certainty they had on the bite, and prosecutors and investigators failed to disclose the important evidence, such as the blood test on the shoes, which was negative. into objectivity and impartiality, the bite mark experts seem to have interpreted the vague evidence in favor of the prosecution and overstated their matches. There is evidence that they ignored and downplayed uncertainties like the distortion and timing of the bite marks, and made absolute claims when the science didn't support that level of certainty. Looking into the biases that were seen in the case, I looked into codes of ethics that were ignored in the case as well. AAFS codes of ethics emphasize the importance of honesty, integrity, and objectivity in forensic practices, and it mandates that members must not misrepresent their qualifications or their data upon which their professional opinions are based in the case. In the Mark Cheney case, when the forensic experts overconfidently explained the certainty of the bite mark evidence, claiming there was a 1 in 1 million match probability without scientific validation, which violates the ethical principles of AAFS. Going into the IAI Code of Ethics, their code outlines the responsibility of a forensic professional to conduct fair examinations as well as maintain objectivity and avoid conflict of interest. The code also stresses the necessity of using accepted protocols and maintaining confidentiality. In the Cheney case, the forensic odontologist failed to adhere to these standards by presenting invalid bite mark analysis as definitive evidence, thereby compromising and undermining the case of fairness in both the examination and the entire case. In the Stephen Mark Cheney case, there were many mistakes made. At his trial, bite mark evidence was presented as key evidence in forensic testimony, and 2 forensic odontologists testified that bite mark on the victim's arm matched Cheney's dental impressions, stating it was a certain match and the mark was his. They also lied about some of the blood evidence that was on the shoe. They claimed the shoe had blood on it, while in fact the specialists were uncertain if there was blood at all, let alone if it was human. If ethical norms and professional conduct had been followed and also properly applied, the case might have proceeded with integrity, honesty, and diligence. Investigators would have ensured that all evidence on both sides is collected and preserved. For example, the blood tests on the shoes would have been thoroughly documented and discrepancies would have been followed up on, as well as there would have been more competence and scientific validity, especially on the bite mark experts who probably would have been required to base their testimonies on methods that were all peer-reviewed and validated. With known error rates, they would have disclosed any uncertainties, alternate interpretations, or changes in their scientific view. The prosecutors would have also been more fair, using all favorable evidence that would have needed to be disclosed to the defense, which means no withholding of the negative blood test or inconsistencies with witness statements. The defense would have been given full information and might have better challenged or discredited the expert dental testimony and would have been able to present the alibi testimonies more strongly, allowing the jury to see that there was a reasonable doubt. After the case and its aftermath, several reforms and safeguards came in the years later, one of which called junk science, which was relief/change in scientific statutes, in which Texas put a law in place that allows relief when evidence used at a trial is based on scientific methods that have since been discredited. The Cheney case was a prominent application of that law. The article is 11073 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. The court, particularly in Texas, now requires that scientific evidence be validated and expert testimony be based on current scientific consensus and peer-reviewed studies. This case, now exonerated and Cheney out of jail, shows how evidence that has been discredited and does not have scientific fact-based reviews should be less used in court and should definitely not be the main convicting point of a case. The science, law, relief, and change will help with that, but there is so much more that needs to be done for cases like these to slowly stop happening. Cheney spent 28 years in jail for something that should not have needed to be so thoroughly fought against by evidence that doesn't have any scientific-based studies. Thank you.